Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Rationstad podcast. 2026 has really launched quickly, not giving anyone of us a break in the meanwhile. For those who have fortunately still been on holiday and have no internet connection until right this second, we will be discussing the two major world events of this year and possibly even the decade. First, the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, no relation to me, and the current ongoing protests in Iran, which have not been showing up much in South African media, but very likely might be the most important headline of this year, if not the decade. We'll be starting with and with both these topics, we'll be discussing how they affect South Africa's foreign policy, because as we know, the ANC is very good friends with the Venezuelan regime and very good friends with the Ayatollah and the Maduro, whatever that word. Sorry, I still got my holiday tongue going. But yes, the mullahs in Iran. And so the collapse of both of those regimes definitely does not bode well for the ANC, which may very well bode well for South Africans in general. To begin, David, I think that the main question that a lot of people have is, and I think let's just start with a basic kind of vague open-ended question, is in Venezuela, is this good that America went in there, even though Trump went on a non-interventionist ticket, but went in there and has cut the head off the snake of Venezuela? Is this going to be good in the long run?
Yeah, so I think after the US became militarily involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran last year, and I think there was a lot of unhappiness within the MAGA base, the MAGA base, about betraying the election promise of keeping out of foreign wars. I mean, I think what was different there was that it was a very surgical strike, very precise, in and out kind of attack, and that seems to have been what happened with the Maduro abduction. And I think the fact that there hasn't been much talk from the Trump administration about regime change. There's a new interim president who's been sworn in. I forget her name, but she's a part of the Chavista regime, and so I think this is obviously a very bold move, and I think strategically very significant as well, given this resuscitation of the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially states that the Western Hemisphere is the United States' backyard, and there's a real reassertion of that. And I think critically, and the Trump administration has been pretty open about this, that the significant oil and mineral reserves that exist in Venezuela are strategically very significant for the United States. And the fact that the Chinese in particular and Russia less so were making a play for those reserves, I think had global significance. So I think Trump checks a lot of boxes here in terms of advancing the United States' strategic interests. And, so if you consider with the shale gas revolution that's happened over the past couple of decades in the United States has actually become a net energy exporter, which has really transformed global energy markets. But a lot of that is light crude. So heavy crude oil comes from Canada, Russia, and Venezuela. And so, the United States' economy is still very much dependent on heavy crude imports, even though it is exporting a lot of natural gas. So I think that there's the advantage of gaining access to these resources. On the other hand, the advantage of depriving your opponents, your enemies, of those resources. I think that is going to tip the scales. I mean, there's some debate over to what extent, what is the size of these reserves? And many people have been saying, well, the Venezuelan regime has been exaggerating the scale of it. So the Venezuelans have said, well, they have about 300 billion barrels worth of known oil reserves, and some people are saying, well, it could be about a third of that. But if you consider that the US stockpile is about 45 billion barrels, so that even on the conservative estimates, that's double the entire United States' oil capacity. So that's pretty significant, I think. And yeah, I think this does represent, I think, a major shift in global affairs as well. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch. To what extent does this upend the so-called liberal order, and multilateralism in general? But yeah, I think that those are some of my kind of first impressions. But I think, yeah, overall, I was delighted to see the decapitation of a vile regime that has inflicted much harm on Venezuelans in general, and has also led to the flight of millions of people, Venezuelans, across the region and to the north as well. The systematic deprivation of private property rights, the debasement of the currency, the fact that this has continued for the last 20 or so years, I think, is an absolute stain on humanity, and I don't shed any tears for Maduro.
I think a very good thing to discuss here, and I think, Martin, you're going to be very much equipped to discuss this next point as well. But also, I just wanted to quickly just go in there that I think that a lot, it's not just oil. I think a lot of, especially opponents of America, like to have this idea that America only cares about oil, and that oil is all that matters. I am also under no deception that I think that, Trump's doing this out of the goodness of his heart. I don't think he knows what the responsibility to protect is, in foreign affairs. But that doesn't matter. I agree with you. We need to focus on the fact that a tyrant has been brought to his knees, and now there's an opportunity. It might lead to something worse, might lead to something better, but now there's an opportunity. Another thing, though, I would like to highlight is the strategic location of Venezuela. And that I think a lot of what's happening now around the world is a preparation for a possible global war. We know that China, Russia, and Iran, and North Korea, I always have to add North Korea in there, even though I think they're borderline irrelevant. Well, they're providing manpower and ammunition, at the very least. They have been joining forces, even though they're not really naturally friends. China and Russia, China wants Russian territory, we know that, but they email me with my friend. And I think that the West is finally starting to wake up to the fact that we're heading towards a global conflict over Ukrainian flashpoints, Taiwan flashpoints, Israel flashpoints, and having an Axis, because that's what they're called, Axis-aligned country in Venezuela, right across the Gulf of Mexico / America, simultaneously supporting the Cuban regime, and also acting as a staging point for Russia, Iran, China, whoever, that is very dangerous. So just even without the oil, making sure that you can get an enemy out of your backyard, especially an enemy that is an illegitimate government. I think that we need to add here, for people who don't know, Maduro lost the election by a landslide. He literally banned his opponent from running. She endorsed someone who was allowed to run, and that guy won. And this is a country where they can rig elections, and they even lost at that point. And then he just refused to stand down. But the point that I think, especially Martin, I think you're equipped to discuss, is I think people have this idea that, okay, why are we backing America? Why are we backing the West? What is the point? And I see someone in the comments here who is very much talking about how saying the US regime are terrorists, that South Africa stands with the Global South. Global South is a stupid term in general. But Martin, so can you lay it out? Why are we siding with the West here? Even if we might not like might not like Donald Trump personally, maybe even might.
Yeah, look, the first thing to say about this, which is something that our opponents, in all other respects, they're like, yeah, things are relative. You can't have absolute freedom. Sometimes you need kind of the government in your society to limit freedom to some extent. We have to accept this. And then when we shift to kind of international affairs, then the idea that things are relative kind of completely evaporates. Then it's like, no, all states are perfectly equal, and the U.S. is a state. The U.S. has done things wrong, and therefore, how can we hypocritically then criticize Iran and Venezuela? No, things are relative. The United States is orders of magnitude better, not perfect, orders of magnitude better as a society, as a global hegemon, than China is, than Russia is, and absolutely than Venezuela is, and than Iran is, and I mean, of course, than Hamas is. So these things are relative. None of us here think that Donald Trump is this great libertarian who just does everything correctly, or his government, or his predecessors were these great presidents. No, the United States government, just like any other government, curbs the liberties of its citizens. They have a massive surveillance state that crosses their borders and, in fact, deprives us of our freedom in our own countries. But we have to, I mean, we're people of logic and reason. We have to be reasonable. And being reasonable in this context is to recognize that in the United States, for example, or let's say amongst Iran's opposition groups, a woman can take off a burqa and walk through town without being harmed. Under the Ayatollah and under the mullahs, she will be killed. In Venezuela, in the US, or amongst the Venezuelan opposition groups, or 30 years ago in Venezuela, you could hold a picture of the president and spit on it, and that's fine. If you do that today under Maduro or under his regime, you will be arrested and tortured. So these things are not akin. There is not just this perfect equality of, well, these things are all interchangeable. One of the things that annoys me the most from our side, from our kind of conservative allies and so on, is and to some degree from our classical liberal allies as well, specifically, is that by doing what the American government did in Venezuela, that somehow now allows China and Russia to do the same thing. Well, no. Again, no. And the best way to manifest this, let me just share my screen. And I know people are annoyed by this, but I'll stick to my guns. What you see here is the Human Freedom Index of the Cato Institute. This is a composite index that relies on press freedom, rule of law, economic freedom, religious freedom, etc. They've kind of combined various indices. I am now on the last page of that index. These are the world's most oppressive states. And what do we see here? Iran and Venezuela. They are here bottom rung. Now we go all the way to the top. What is this? There's the United States. It is an orders of magnitude more free society than Venezuela, than Iran. These are not equal. They're not equal states. It doesn't mean that if the US does something, that means that Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran also get to do it. No. If you're a freer society, you get to do things that less free societies don't get to do. How do I come to that conclusion? Well, that's a massive kind of rabbit hole to go down. But if you're vaguely familiar with the idea of the social contract, how is it that the state comes to be legitimate in society? That is how. The United States has a significantly more legitimate government that may do things that governments do, that more illegitimate regimes do not get to do. And we have to agree about this. Otherwise, the very legitimacy of the state per se must collapse. And I mean, more than that, I know Cape Socialist, I've engaged with him a few times on Twitter, I think, in the past. But he's a Democrat. He's one of those people, like, as he says now, we, the majority of us in the global south, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, they had an election, as you said, Nicholas, in Venezuela, which Maduro lost. He's not the president of Venezuela. I've been trying to make this point. The president of Venezuela is a man called Edmundo Gonzalez. He has not rejected the US intervention. He has, I think, implicitly embraced it. So the government of Venezuela, the majority of Venezuelans have welcomed the intervention. And just because Maduro happens to control a criminal cabal that kind of gives him effective power does not change that. So we have to accept this. Otherwise, we're just saying, well, elections are kind of for show, and we don't really mind the outcomes of these contests. So that's kind of the, just to address that point. Just quickly on the oil thing. It, a lot of the kind of liberals and libertarians are also now saying, for example, that it's not this is not about spreading democracy. It's not about spreading liberty. It's about oil. And as I was telling David yesterday, it's like, well, of course. I mean, if I had a neighbor and my neighbor was supplying the criminal gang kind of 2 blocks over with certain resources to undermine my interests, yes, I'll take out my neighbor, of course. I mean, that just makes sense. It makes rational sense, as you've said, Nicholas. And I mean, that's why I've always been kind of perplexed by why the Americans have allowed Cuba to persist as this kind of militant enemy of the United States in its own backyard. It's a massive security threat. I don't get that. I don't get the calculation. I think they should have dealt with Cuba decades ago, installed a puppet regime. I mean, let's call it whatever you want, installing a more free government in Cuba. Of course, people are now going to say that's exactly what Russia did in Ukraine. But again, not all states are created equal. Freer states do get to do things that less free states do not. And then just finally on Trump's intentions. What is it with people and intentions? I mean, we've had the race law discussion on this podcast so many times. It is so bloody annoying that everyone is always preoccupied with, oh, what is the real kind of motivator here? And everyone ignores the thing that is happening. What is the thing that just happened? Well, a tyrant was arrested. Why in God's name should anyone now be shedding tears for Nicolás Maduro? That is bizarre. I don't care what Trump's intentions are. I do not care what Donald Trump thinks about anything. I care about what happens in practice. What has just happened in practice is a good thing. When the United States bombed Iran's nuclear facilities last year, what happened there is a good thing. I don't care if they did it for some Zionist kind of plot or for some weird kind of extension of American hegemony. That is a good thing. You do not want the mullahs to have a nuclear capability. If they intervene more in Venezuela and Cuba, in Venezuela, maybe Trump wants to build a big resort somewhere in Iran. I do not care. Nobody should care. What matters is, are the people of Venezuela, of Iran, going to be more free or less free? That will matter to me. If the people of Venezuela now get some genocidal maniac who replaces Maduro, that matters. That will matter. And then maybe the intervention will be retroactively sullied by that. I don't think that's what's going to happen, at least not soon. I might be wrong. But what matters is what has happened, not what is being intended. So yeah, that's kind of my broad thoughts around this. But we really need to make some kind of effort to stop caring about what personalities think about things. I don't understand that preoccupation that seems to override, firstly, the nature of what is happening, and secondly, the consequences of what is happening. Surely these two things have to be far more important than just what someone's subjective feelings and intentions are about something.
Very good. And, I agree with you completely. You touched on this, and I just wanted to extend it a bit, that the Axis powers, I'm just going to use it as a broad way to refer to these rogue states that have become friends. I just wanted to measure them from left-wing talking points, because a lot of lefties aren't going to they're not going to care about property rights, not going to care about freedom. It's going to affect them, and they're going to really care about it when it affects them. But let's talk about the things that they care about. So LGBT rights and women's rights. Iran literally murders women for not wearing headscarves. They kill gay people. They have transgender surgery, but to force people to transition, so then they will no longer be gay. And they also do not get, and also it's one of those things where they prop up, and we're not actually sure if they're actually transitioning people properly. Russia, one of the worst LGBT rights in the world. They kill, they disappear the gay people. They completely clamped down on punk rock bands who talk about LGBT rights and women's rights. They're also an incredibly unequal society. So we're talking about material inequality. They're an incredibly unequal society. You have a bunch of mafia oligarchs at the top, and they're ruling over a peasant class. They're also an empire that still rules over a very ethnically diverse country where everyone but Muscovites are heavily repressed. We've got China, which also incredibly homophobic, currently undergoing genocide against the Uyghur population. They also have a social credit system where if you do anything that goes against what the state wants, and they've got these really petty things that they want, you will be shut down. You will not be allowed to use public transport. You'll not be allowed to use the internet. You will not even be allowed to access your own money. You might eventually disappear. There was this MMA fighter, Chinese MMA fighter who very, very good, but he used Western style fighting techniques, and he used to ridicule Chinese martial arts, because I think anyone who's in MMA knows that you do whatever it takes. You don't just do some weird petty dancing and think that that counts. The Chinese government didn't like this because they saw it as ridiculing their culture. So they disappeared him. They made him culturally irrelevant. He couldn't use public transport. He was arrested at all of his before any of his fights. That is just violating essential freedoms. They're also incredibly racist. I think you should also see some Chinese commercials. They are extremely racist. They are not a friend of Africa. They're not a friend of anyone. They're more white supremacists than white people. They're not even white. They are, and you already spoke on Venezuela. These are not countries which the global left should be aligning themselves with. But the problem is, I think that the global left doesn't really care about these talking points. They don't really care about the people's rights. And I think there's a quote from this journalist, Greg Grandin, which I discovered recently, unfortunately, because I accidentally bought one of his books thinking it would actually be useful. And I saw some of his quotes where he said of the late Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, yes, the Venezuelan president could be a strong man, but he leaves behind what might be called the most democratic country in the Western Hemisphere. But in the same article, he also says that Chavez's problem wasn't that he was too authoritarian. It was that he was not authoritarian enough. That is, this reveals what a lot of these left-wing people really want. They want an authoritarian regime, almost, I think, in a way that they get a sixth sense of satisfaction when people they don't like or institutions they don't like are trampled on, regardless of what the results are, regardless of how many little people, regardless of how many normal people are trampled on in the meanwhile. And I think
you answer something there, Nicholas. So just to pick up on that point, if you think of a figure like Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, there's no kind of left-wing dictatorship that he doesn't like, and including Chavez's regime and Maduro who followed. And I think the common thread there is anybody who's really kind of anti-Western in their posture. I think often these left-wing movements will default to celebrating them. That's why you have Queers for Palestine, very unambiguously kind of backing Hamas, which has been known to throw homosexuals off of the tops of buildings. So there is no contradiction there, because there is this anti-Western theme which underpins it. So that, and I think also the other point is, when you have a collectivist mindset, the imperatives of social justice, the collective will, are what matters more than the individuals and their experience. So, well, sorry for you, Mr. MMA fighter, who criticizes the nation. You're just going to be steamrolled by history, because your individual viewpoints, your individual rights and needs are irrelevant to the broader collectivist imperative.
Yeah, if I could just also add, I think Konstantin Kisin, which you'll be familiar with, made a good point here recently, specifically on what's happened in Venezuela and Iran. And I think it makes perfect sense. What the left has done, and I'm not now talking about kind of Vladimir Putin as a member of the left. I mean kind of these activist types in the West. They have, and understandably, they have simply transmuted their domestic ideology to the international sphere. What is the most evil thing to Western leftists? the West. The West is the most evil thing ever because it's capitalism. It's they perceive it as being dominated by whites, by men. Um, it's largely Judeo-Christian, kind of in background values. So, what is the most evil thing ever? It can only be the West. This is their lived activism experience, and therefore, in any geopolitical conflict, the West will always be the bad guy. It's not that the kind of the masses of people in Iran or Venezuela matter. What matters to them is that those opposition groups that represent the majority are aligned with the West. And if they're aligned with the West, then they are illegitimate. And therefore, we must lie, like Cape Socialist is doing in the comments, and say that Nicolás Maduro won the election, kind of by some force of magic, winning an election with 1 point something million against the 6 point something million that Edmundo Gonzalez got. We must lie because Edmundo Gonzalez was endorsed by Maria Machado. Maria Machado is brazenly and openly pro-West, pro-liberal, pro-free market, etc. Same with the opposition groups in Iran. Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, the current only legitimate head of state of Iran, he lives in the West. He's openly aligned with Western liberal values. Therefore, everyone he represents, the tens and scores of millions of Iranians, they're immediately delegitimized because they're aligned with the West. That is the calculation that the Western leftists are making. It's not about history to them. It's not about values to them. It's not about class relations to them. It's not about race relations to them. Cape Socialist is saying the Chinese aren't racist. So he's willing to ignore that kind of reality that many Black South Africans who've been in not just in China but in Japan and many Asian countries who come back home to South Africa and testify to the very virulent racism that they get from those societies. That's irrelevant. What's relevant? The opposition is aligned with the West.
Can I just get back to the geopolitics for a moment, Nicholas? So what I think is significant about this is the impact that this has on China and the signal that it sends to them. So not only are they losing access to energy reserves, which they were very intentionally making a play for. I mean, just as a sidebar question, people will say, oh, the United States is only interested in energy. Well, like, what do you think the Russians and the Chinese were there for? Like, to learn the recipes of arepas, No, they were interested in the energy. So everybody's self-interested in this international arena, this snooker table of competing state interests. So this would, I think, give them pause. I think, particularly with regards to the Taiwan question. I think many commentators have long speculated that this is going to be the year. And I think Xi Jinping has specifically stated this in some of the PRC propaganda, that they want reunification with Taiwan. And the United States has maintained what is called, I think, strategic ambiguity, Nicholas, I think, is that the term? And the Chinese are very keen for the United States to reject any claims of Taiwanese independence. And so I think that a mobilization of troops and military power to take Taiwan, I think there would be some hesitation there from Beijing about doing that in light of this event. I mean, just also remember that the Chinese had supplied the Venezuelans with quite advanced military hardware and capabilities. And basically, the United States was just able to walk in there in 4 hours and take the head of state. So, I think it showed perhaps that people underestimate just how sophisticated U.S. military power is. And I think their willingness to use it in a very targeted way, I think, would send a signal to their adversaries. And, obviously, the Chinese will also bear in mind that in terms of access to microchip processes, the Taiwanese, that's the center of microchip production in the world. And the Chinese really rely on that for some of their artificial intelligence technology and some of their own military hardware as well. So I think that's another factor that's going to be in play. But yeah, I think, like you were saying, Nicholas, as well, just in terms of the geostrategic advantage, the positioning of Venezuela as well. And I think, with Milei's friendly government in Argentina, new center-right government in Chile, I think you're starting to see a changing of the political guard in Latin America. There's still some left-wing holdouts like in Brazil and Colombia. But I think the future of the Western Hemisphere looks a little bit brighter in the absence of Nicolás Maduro's leadership.
I'm bullish about Latin America at the moment. I think that the people want freedom. I think they've been tricked and they've been manipulated, and they've also just been run roughshod over, because most revolutions are not run by the public or by popular demand. They're forced in by a bunch of elites, often foreigners. And Che Guevara went around screwing up everyone else's country. He stayed away from his own. But something which I wanted to also say is I want to feel sorry for people like Cape Socialist, a lot of these left-wing people that Lenin called the useful idiots. I don't feel sorry for them, because I think that we live in an age of information abundance where we can discover the facts, we can discover the true story very easily. I think it takes, at least from me, it takes somewhat an intention to be ignorant. But also there's, I remember listening to a podcast that was released a few months before the invasion of Ukraine. I wish it waited a little bit, because I think that would have been excellent to cover that. It was by Max Brooks, who, amongst being the author of World War Z and the son of Mel Brooks, one of the greatest living comedians, is also the world expert on asymmetrical warfare and an influential professor at West Point. And he had this very good discussion with Dan Carlin on Hardcore History, where they were discussing that the fact that Russia and China are waging the psychological warfare that America doesn't know how to respond to, because you can't nuke someone and you can't invade someone just for creating bot farms or creating propaganda. But the problem is that this propaganda has eroded a lot of the cultural unity of the West. It has not just created a generation that hates the country they live in. It's also created a depression, because we know that there's huge amounts of evidence that TikTok, which is controlled by the Chinese government, causes people to become depressed. It causes people to not be able to get into relationships. It's a platform that's created to create social dysfunction. And in Russia, when there was an initial blanket ban over on Russian IPs on Reddit, they found that bipartisan debate between Democrats and Republicans that on Reddit just dropped, because most of the people fighting and creating this conflict were Russians. It wasn't actual Americans. And they're fabricating these conflicts. I think that there's been a proper Cold War. The Cold War never ended. It just expanded, and it went a little bit, and the tone changed. And I think that the problem with the West for the longest time now is we've been pretending that it ended. And for China, it never ended. For Russia, it never ended. For Iran, it never ended. And for Iran, it's not really been, well, it's been a Cold War in the sense of the proxies, but it's led to some really hot warfare. David?
And Nicholas, you can also make an argument that actually the United States has been very reluctant to get involved in Latin American affairs post-Cold War. I mean, it's almost a kind of a sheepishness, like, oh, okay, well, look, there's this communist dictatorship 90 miles from Key West in Florida, that we're just going to kind of let this carry on for 7 decades or however long it's been since the Fidel took over in the 50s. So, I think there's actually been a kind of a realization that you do need to assert your interests, and that this is the United States' backyard, and liberty is worth defending. And if you have a whole array of hostile actors on your doorstep, that's not really good for the preservation of liberty. So I share your bullishness when it comes to Latin America, Nicholas. I think there's a lot of hope for the future.
I do think. Sorry, Nicholas, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just a short point. I was just saying, and I think you'll agree with me, Martin, that America is the least imperialist major power in world history. Because literally the only thing that holds back any normal nation throughout the whole of world history, including now, is that they don't conquer other countries because they can't, or because they're scared of the consequences. And the consequence isn't international law. We couldn't, the ICC couldn't even arrest al-Bashir. And he's from a crackpot little dictatorship with which couldn't defend itself. I'm pretty sure you could have seen some two detectives from Scotland Yard in there, and they could have arrested him. But America literally does not intervene in Latin America, does not take down Cuba, as you said, Martin and David, because they don't want to, because they hold themselves, they limit themselves to this ideology that there needs to be some sort of world peace, that they can't just intervene, the sovereignty matters. International law is America. And without America, without American hegemony, without America actually holding up the international law, there is no international law. And the irony is that everyone kept stepping on America's toes and kept dissing them and kept treating them like they're the enemy. That why should they hold up this international law anymore, especially when this international law is being used as a cover for tyrants? Martin.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point I wanted to make. This is something that I find it's so rich coming from these kind of international law professors. Like, as you said, I mean, I can't put it better than that. International law is the United States. The David referred to the post-war kind of so-called liberal world order. I think the liberalism of it is somewhat overstated. It was peaceful-ish, but it always depended on American enforcement. I mean, that was the unspoken rule all across the board. International law, there is no such thing unless the Americans enforce it, because no one else is willing to enforce it. And in a group of friends, I kind of pointed out this ridiculousness a few days ago. It's like the West created international law. It said we have these standards after the war. We don't want genocide to happen. We don't want apartheid to happen. This is another one. We don't want crimes against humanity to happen. And then they kind of sat on their hands and pretended like international law was going to enforce itself. No. Who is shooting at the pirates at the Horn of Africa? It's the United States. It's not the African Union. It's not the Somali Navy defending the Horn of Africa. It's the United States. China, to its credit, I think is also now participating. It's the powerful countries that enforce international law. So pretending now to say that no, there's this international law, like the ANC said. I think Letuliao said that if you wanted to deal with Nicolás Maduro, you had to go to the ICJ, they said. And when I said, oh, the ICJ, everyone is like, no, but when I said, well, the ANC didn't take Maduro to the ICJ, the ANC bots came and said, well, there's no basis to take Maduro to the ICJ. Exactly. So why is the ANC saying rather go through the international kind of judicial system? So the ANC said ICJ, they said the United Nations Security Council. Nonsense. Both those institutions have allowed tyranny in Venezuela to persist for 2 decades, for the better part of a century now in Iran. And I mean, look at North Korea. It is international law that North Korea exists. There exists only Korea, but there is an armistice, an arbitrary line in the sand drawn by international law. So I mean, I remember when I did my undergraduate degree in law, we had a module in international law. And I mean, no one took that seriously. Even the lecturers, my professors, chuckled half the time when they were explaining these principles of customary international law and all these things to us and treaties and so on. I also made the point yesterday on Twitter. It's like the agreement between the UK and China to hand over Hong Kong. That's now, that's an agreement. The United Kingdom couldn't break that agreement. Of course not. It's international law. But the agreement that the United States, Russia, and Ukraine concluded, I think the United Kingdom was also there, that the territorial integrity of Ukraine will be respected. Everyone ignored that. Russia ignored it by invading the United States, and the United Kingdom ignored it by not intervening to stop the invasion. So it's a hodgepodge of arbitrariness, international law. Ultimately, it comes down to what does the global hegemon want? And we as liberals, as Westerners, rather than bitching and moaning and whining like the whiner Dave Smith amongst the American libertarian movement, these people that ostensibly are part of us, instead of whining about it, we should thank God that the international hegemon is not some libertarian utopia, but is more liberal than the next 2 or 3 or 4 next best things. We should thank God that the United States of America is the global hegemon, because it could be China, it could be Russia. After that, you get places like France and so on. I mean, I think that's a nightmare all on its own. But this is on the relative spectrum of imperfectness that we live in. This is the best possible outcome, is to have the United States as a global hegemon, unless you want a global government. We can have a discussion about that, but that is the only other option. There is no option of an impartial and objective international law that zaps you when you break it. It's going to have to be enforced by someone. And thank goodness the enforcer is more liberal than the alternatives.
David, you want to say something?
Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, I saw a clip of the Swedish former prime minister, I forget his name now, kind of saying, you know, look, Trump is just drunk on power, and they're just kind of, after the success there, they're kind of gloating, and, you know, but actually us Europeans, you know, we believe in treaties and agreements and soft power. And I'm like, well, okay, that's all very good and well, but what is enforcing that? You know, ultimately you need to be able to enforce that. And the soft power has not done very much to preserve Ukraine from being invaded by the Russians, right? So, I mean, ultimately, any law needs to be backed by some kind of coercive capacity. I mean, I think, just in defense of the critics, I mean, obviously, you don't just want the Americans to engage in kind of raw, naked power abuse. You do want there to be guardrails and guidelines for how you conduct these kinds of things. And I think that there is a strong argument that the White House should have gotten congressional approval. For example, I'm sure somebody like Rand Paul will be making this argument, as he has been doing for many decades. So yeah, but, you know, if you just kind of look at the pure efficacy of international law, like, where was international law when Chavez and Maduro were systematically abusing the rights of Venezuelans? I mean, the fact that on average the average height of a Venezuelan has gone down because they're all malnourished, that criminality and starvation have spread through this country, a once prosperous country. And I think that's also why Venezuela is important for the West. You know, there are many kind of socialist crackpot kind of countries that have always been poor. But Venezuela was once a wealthy country. And I mean, it shows you how you shouldn't take those things for granted. Your freedoms do guarantee prosperity, and taking away freedom is a guarantee of undermining that prosperity. So I think that's very important to bear in mind.
I think a thing we haven't really been mentioning, but international law, as in multilateral power and, you know, the hegemon being held in check, which I think that's what a lot of people want. It's effectively only enforced because a bunch of different countries other than the US have nuclear weapons, and there is a mutually assured destruction people fear. And it's terrible. It's like, I wish nukes were never invented, not because, you know, by themselves they're incredibly dangerous, and and we might end up living in Fallout, which is not going to be as fun as the games. But because it means that the Soviet Union was able to rape its way across Europe, rape its way across Asia, and maintain this huge empire that is enforced by a peasant economy. Like, Russia is a modern-day medieval state which has to import its technology from the rest of the world. Without the Industrial Revolution in the West, the Industrial Revolution that capitalism created, it would still be a serfdom run by czars. It would, and those are, even if the czars call themselves socialist. And the same goes for the Islamic world. The same goes for all these socialist states. The same goes for Africa. The only reason that there's any sort of progress, the only reason that we have the standard of living in the world is because of capitalism. And the only reason they can survive is because they stole the technology that capitalist world invented And now they use it to say, hey, you can't attack us because we'll just nuke you and millions of people will die, if not billions. And that is the unfairness of it, that you can have these terrible countries that literally just have a suicide vest on. But I think we can shift the focus. We've discussed it a little bit, but let's shift the focus to the Iran protests, because this is something that the mainstream media has only really been touching on. They haven't really been talking about it, especially in South Africa. I haven't seen any South African news about the Iranian protests. Some major developments of it. So now, for people who don't know, these are economic protests that boiled over into mass protests. There's already dozens of deaths. Something I don't like about Trump is Trump said there'd be boots on the ground if any protesters died. There's no boots on the ground yet, so I'm disappointed by that. But I know Trump's a big beck, so we can't take everything he says seriously. So the thing about Iran is they've been running out of water because they're essentially planned economy. So they don't have any of these checks and balances the markets provide to keep people fed and watered. They have currency collapse. They've been a huge country at the crossroads of empire with huge oil reserves that have been squandered because of bad policies, because they've combined two of the worst things in the world. They've combined socialist planning with Islamic fundamentalism. They're just like properly the most evil state in the world for that. And its population doesn't like that. Iran, being an Islamic theocracy, has the fastest growing Christian population in the world. They're the birthplace of Zoroastrianism, they were systematically slaughtered and the victims of genocide. Yet they still persist. And in a diaspora around the world, Freddie Mercury was a Zoroastrian of Queen. Now, the latest thing is that they've shut down the internet, which usually they do that before they are going to be doing the real bad stuff. So hopefully the protesters hopefully there's honestly a flip and the military realizes that its bread is no longer buttered on the side of the mullahs, and it becomes a popular uprising with military backing. Martin, I think what do you think? Do you think this is going to be the time? Do you think the Iranian regime is going to collapse?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very kind of ambivalent about it. And I wore this Hong Kong t-shirt specifically today for that reason, because of that ambivalence. So in 2018, 2019, thereabouts, there were huge protests in Hong Kong. Millions of people took to the streets to protest the assertion of Beijing central power in Hong Kong, which had up to that point been quite autonomous from mainland China. And what effectively happened there was the protests were ongoing, and then almost as if by magic, it was just over. The leaders were gone, and it's like a memory hole. It's gone. It's never happened. It's done. The Chinese Communist Party disappeared those leaders. They threatened them, and it just ended the whole thing like a damp squib. Now, I'm very worried that we could see something similar happen in Iran now. As you say, there's probably killings going on right now that already started before the blackout on the internet. And we need to remember there was also, I think they called it the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, which led to the election of a moderate, let's call him, president of Iran. And people saw that as kind of a shift away from power from the Ayatollah towards a more moderate government. Obviously, that's not what happened. If anything, it probably got worse. So I'm worried that a lot of the excitement we're seeing now might be for naught. And it's for naught again because where is the reinforcements? It's the same story I've had with Ukraine. People celebrate online saying, look, Ukraine has shot down another Russian jet, or they've sunk another Russian ship, they've blown up another Russian refinery. My question is always, where are the reinforcements? Where are the reinforcements? Where are the reinforcements? It was the same story last year after Maduro lost the election in Venezuela. People rioted in the streets. They rioted. There was real protests in Venezuela, and people were excited, saying they're gonna annul Maduro's power grab. My question was, where are the reinforcements? And they never came. I was very happy when Trump said that they will attack Iran if they start killing people. I hope that happens. Because that's where the answer lies. Because unarmed civilians, can only take you so far in a revolution. Iran has disarmed its population. Venezuela has disarmed its population. That always precedes periods of intense tyranny in a society. They disarm their civilian population, and then yes, the civilians can take it up to a point. They can go into the streets. They can burn down police stations. But the reinforcements have to come at some stage. And Nicholas, I think you hit the nail on the head there. This is what Reza Pahlavi is focusing on. He's trying to turn the military. That would be the best reinforcement, is if the military says we are not going to start massacring our own fellow countrymen, we are instead going to join them. So that would be reinforcements. But if that doesn't happen, the next best thing is you need a coalition of international partners to come in and provide support. And I find it utterly perverse that it's so arbitrary. It happened in Syria. The Syrians got American reinforcements. The Syrian rebels, they got American reinforcements. But the Venezuelans never got American reinforcements. The Iranians aren't getting American reinforcements or Israeli reinforcements. So I'm very happy that this is happening. I'm not happy about the bloodshed, but I am happy that the seemingly invincibleness of the Iranian regime is being challenged and being shown up and shown you are not invincible, and in fact that the people of your country do not want you. I'm glad that that manifestation is happening, but I'm very, very concerned about getting overly excited about where this might lead. I hope it leads where we're all thinking it might lead, is a transition in that country. But the Alatoya still has the support of the military, as far as I can tell. And unless there's reinforcements or a change of heart amongst the rank and file of the security forces, I don't see this kind of resulting in tomorrow we have a liberal democracy in Iran. At best, maybe we'll have another version of the Green Revolution, where the elite says, okay, we've heard your concerns, fine, we're going to make some modest reforms, let's just stop the bloodshed. But ultimately, Iran keeps being the hotspot of international terrorism, and so forth. So yeah, I don't want to be the damp squib on the kind of the party pooper on what appears to be a real kind of revolutionary sentiment in Iran and in Venezuela to some degree. But I've burned my hand on this quite a few times before, by trusting the West too much, like by thinking, of course, the CIA is there helping. Probably not. So I'm a little bit worried about that.
Oh, hopefully Mossad is there helping. And hopefully Operation Rising Lion isn't ended.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think something to watch would be what happens in Israel. So Israel is actually facing legislative elections in October. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the great survivor of Israeli politics, will be kind of watching that closely and watching developments in Iran. And I think obviously there have been protests around the country, but what happens in Tehran specifically, I think will determine a lot. And yeah, I mean, we just remind everybody of just how tyrannical this regime is. Dissidents are hung off of cranes in the full visibility of the populace. This is what happens when you challenge the regime. But I think there are some conditions which would give cause for optimism. I think Martin's cautionary note there is important. But I think the first is Ayatollah Khamenei is very frail and old. I think he's about 86. And there have been rumors that he's been planning an exit if things get really, really bad, and following Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian leader, to Russia. The Iranian regime has been stealing from its people for many decades. So there's a lot of offshore wealth, properties, secret funds, and so on that would be able to fund him. So getting back to the Israelis, so the 12-day war, I think, really exposed some of the fragility of the Iranian military establishment and the precision with which the Israeli Defense Force was able to take out key leadership within the Israeli Revolutionary Guard. I think that those memories will be fresh. I also think, like Nicholas mentioned, you've got this financial crisis. I think the Iranian rial is at something like $1 million to the US dollar. So I think it's depreciated by something like 40%, I think is the number. And food inflation is about 70%. So that's really creating quite severe conditions. So, I think there might also be a calculus that it's really kind of now or never, or if not now, then a very long time from now, that maybe a nudge, eliminating some key leadership or supporting with tactical strikes could actually tip the balance of power in favor of the protesters. And I think there will be a lot of confidence from what happened in Venezuela. And I think there is a lot to be gained. I think a free Persia would really transform the Middle East. Iran is pretty much enemies with everyone. It has this proxy terror network, which Israel has done very well to push back against, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and various others, Hamas as well. But they're a strong adversary of Israel, but also Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And I think for those with longer memories than us, Iran was once, a pretty pro-Western, kind of secular kind of place, and with a long tradition going back thousands of years, a very proud culture, and a very rich culture. So maybe it doesn't turn into some kind of libertarian paradise overnight, but I think a friendly Iran would really create a lot of positives in the world, and would restore a lot of freedom. And it does have a lot of potential, a lot of really dynamic, capable people who I think would benefit from being unshackled from the authority of the mullahs.
I like to share your optimism, David. I think Master's being a party pooper, which I see exactly why he's believing that, though. And something which I want to touch on before we close off is which was mentioned before, but something which makes this different. Because I was saying how all the powers in the world are starting to head towards a possible global conflict. We know China is a collapsing empire. It knows that it's reached the peak of its free growth. It knows that it needs to do something. So it's going to so it needs to do something quickly in order to resuscitate its national identity, its national power. That's taking Taiwan. That's what Winnie the Pooh wants to do. He's wanting to ensure that his legacy lasts, that he's the one who reunites China. And that's why I think that we are going to probably see a play for that, unless America and the West, but I think it's basically America by itself at the moment. I think that most of the West is not really playing a ball at the moment, except for Israel, and except for Ukraine, and except for Taiwan, actually. Those are the countries which are all playing ball. And South Korea. South Korea is doing well. So it's not actually as alone, but it's quite ironic that two of the Western countries playing ball are in the East. But I just want people to know that regardless of if you're pro-West, anti-West, whatever, America was able to send a small team into a foreign country and take their de facto, if not de jure, head of state in 3.5 hours with no casualties on their side. That is a alien level of technology. This is people don't realize that America is playing space level warfare while the rest of the world is still stuck in pre-World War One with stolen military technology holding them afloat. And that is something which I think we should be optimistic about, that if it wasn't for nukes, America could probably do a world conquest. And I think that would be a good thing. I know that some people in the comments might not agree with that. I think that would be far better than what a lot of other countries are going through. And we're not going to get what I would hope for, which is a Pax Polandia or Pax Israelia, which I think would be even better. But America will do. That is all from me. Martin, your closing statement.
Yeah, so look, I've never been a Donald Trump supporter, and that hasn't changed. I'm still not a Donald Trump supporter. I think his domestic policies are horrible. I think what's happening with ICE raids in the United States right now is absolutely like horrifying. Like it's disgusting what I see happening in the U.S. around kind of immigration raids, people being killed, courts being completely ignored. I think it is disgusting, really, and I think his economic policies are atrocious. But Donald Trump has surprised me very pleasantly on foreign policy. I was very, very worried that he was going to be the isolationist who pulls the United States out of world affairs and lets chaos reign. Um, and I was very worried specifically about Ukraine, never really about Israel, but specifically about Ukraine. I think he is mishandling the Ukraine situation, but him mishandling it is better than him just saying, go away. But he has done God's work by taking Nicolás Maduro. He has done God's work by almost with the snap of fingers returning the Israeli hostages to their families. He has done God's work by bombing Iran. And just the sentiment, sharing the sentiment that if the Iranians kill their citizens, we will intervene. That to me is such a great thing for Donald Trump to have done. I think JD Vance doesn't agree with his president. I think if he becomes president, that would be a problem. I like Marco Rubio. I think if Marco Rubio is the next president after Donald Trump, that would be a good thing. But I just really want to go on the record and say Donald Trump really deserves a lot of credit for his handling of foreign policy. I think he is representing the absolute best of what America can be on the global stage. He's just pulled the United States out of a bunch of ridiculous time and money wasting international organizations, which is good. And if he pulled the U.S. out of the Security Council, that would be bad. But he didn't. He didn't pull the U.S. out of NATO. He didn't pull it out of Security Council, but he did pull it out of these kind of nonsensical organizations. That is a good thing. That is really, really good. What he's saying about Greenland is really, really bad. But if he ends up buying Greenland rather than invading it, I think that's okay. So I just think we have to acknowledge that you can have a bad president in Donald Trump who still does very, very good things that deserve praise, which many of our fellow liberals just aren't getting. They want to criticize everything that the Trump administration does just because it is the Trump administration. If Joe Biden or Barack Obama did this, they would have said that this is a great humanitarian effort by a great humanitarian president. So I think Trump deserves a lot of credit for what he's doing. And hopefully, if there is a flashpoint in Taiwan, it happens during the Trump administration or during the Rubio administration, so that defense can happen there. I'm glad to see that Japan seems to be flexing its muscles as well alongside South Korea, and I hope that the kind of Taiwan's regional allies will pull their weight. I agree with you, Nicholas. It is kind of the U.S. seems to be the only game in town now. Even after its own backdoor was invaded, Europe still can't get it. It is absolutely horrifying to see how Europe is still fumbling, even as Russian troops have invaded Europe. I mean, it's bizarre to me that a civilization can lack a sense of self-preservation to this degree. So I don't know what's going on in Europe, but it is a good thing that the United States has, to some degree, embraced. I mean, I know a lot of American libertarians hate this, but embraced its role as a global policeman, a corrupt policeman. A corrupt policeman. Let's get that on the kind of on the agenda, but still. Yeah, no, there's, I mean, you get the corrupt policeman or you don't get anyone. You get the corrupt policeman or you get the genocidal maniacs. So I'll take the corrupt policeman, and I'm glad that Trump has kind of abandoned his isolationist sentiments. So yeah, I think that's more or less it. Of course, South Africa will continue to take the wrong side of everything that we've just discussed. We should not be under any illusions. As we speak right now, there are Iranian, Russian, and Chinese ships docked in Simonstown, rather than American and Ukrainian and Israeli ships docked in Simonstown. That speaks volumes. So rest assured that our government will always ask what is the wrong thing to do in geopolitics, and it will always do the wrong thing, even under the much vaunted GNU. So I don't have any hope in that respect.
think that's a good place to end. I think at the pace of global news and politics at the moment, hopefully we see you next week, and that Taiwan isn't being invaded and the internet hasn't been wiped out by nuclear devastation. But just in case that doesn't happen, we'll continue to be here next week on the Rational Standard podcast. Make sure to follow us on X, the website formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, and also make sure to check out our Substack at www.rationalstandard.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers.